Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jerry Paulson. I'm a professor of pediatrics at the George Washington University School of Medicine and a professor of environmental and occupational health at the GW School of Public Health. I'm also the director of the Mid-Atlantic Center for Children's Health and the Environment, one of 10 pediatric environmental health specialty units in the country. And before we finish today, we'll spend some time talking about what a pediatric environmental health specialty unit is and how PEHSU, which is how you pronounce P-E-H-S-U, might be able to serve as a resource for you in your day-to-day work. I want to thank the Maryland Public Health Training Center for facilitating this session. We have some people here in the room with me, and we have some people online. So I can see the ones in front of me, but I can't see those of you who are online. I hope that everything is coming through very clearly. The Mid-Atlantic Center is partly funded by the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry and by the Environmental Protection Agency. They do not review or approve anything that I say. They, in fact, may not agree with everything that I say, but they do require me to provide you with this disclaimer whenever I make a presentation on behalf of the Mid-Atlantic Center. So I'm presuming that everybody who's here and participating today has some interest in what goes on at the nexus between children, health, and the environment. And I think it's very important to recognize that children are not little adults. If one takes what one knows about adults and uses that to make decisions about protecting children from environmental health hazards, then the decisions that you make will be incorrect. And so we're going to spend a fair amount of time today talking about differences between kids and adults. Some of these differences are very obvious on the one hand, and if you've been involved in pediatrics or maternal and child health work, on the one hand, you know all of this stuff, but how to apply what you already know or how to apply what may be fairly obvious to the context of protecting children from environmental health hazards is the key to what we're going to be doing today. So for those of you who are here in the room, those of you who are listening online, I want you to take 10 seconds, close your eyes. I know it's 3:30 in the afternoon. You've got you know, a little bit of after lunch sleepiness, so don't fall asleep on me. But close your eyes and think about the environment for 10 seconds. Okay, and before you do drift off, open up your eyes. And at least for those of you who are in the room who can answer, as you thought about the environment, that image that came to your mind, how many of you saw people in that image? One. Okay, for those of you who didn't see people, which is the most common answer, I've asked this question all over the US, I've asked it in Europe, I've asked it in Israel, and recently I had an opportunity to ask it in Kenya. For those of you who didn't see people, what did you see? What was the image that came to your mind? Buildings? A park? Anything else? Different landscapes. Different landscapes. Okay, so I have nothing against, you know, green spaces, trees. In Kenya, some people saw, not surprisingly, lions and rhinos and things that are a little more common to their day-to-day life than to ours. I have nothing against, you know, polar bears, lions, tigers, what have you. But I have a hypothesis. I don't know how to test this hypothesis, but my hypothesis is that if we as members of a society, a global society, thought more about human beings when we thought about the environment and thought about how we as humans fit into the environment, thought about how we as humans and as other human beings are influenced by the environment in which we fit, that we would do a better job of protecting the environment and preventing the adverse health impacts that come from environmental degradation. So that's my hypothesis. Don't know how to test it, but it informs a lot of what we're going to talk about today and a lot of the work that, that I do. So kids breathe differently than adults do. We'll talk about that in more detail, but if you don't recognize that, again, if you're making air pollution standards, you're going to make wrong decisions. How many of you have little kids or little brothers and sisters or little nieces and nephews and have ever tried to feed them? So why are you laughing? They make a mess, they use their hands, they put everything in their mouth. And do they eat the same foods that adults typically eat or the same patterns that adults follow? No. So again, if you're trying to protect kids from pesticide residues on food, if you assume that the child's eating pattern is the same as adults, you're going to make wrong assumptions in terms of trying to protect them. Clearly, there are differences in the brains of young children from the brains of adults, and we'll talk about that. So here's a provocative question. So should women who are on oral contraceptives or men on hormone replacement therapy be allowed to urinate into a sewer system that discharges into ground or surface water, when that ground or surface water may be what's used for drinking water for the town downstream? And we all live downstream from somewhere. Does the construction of our roads and highways influence the prevalence of obesity? Can noise from an airplane overhead influence a child's learning? And the answer to that one actually is yes. There are a lot of good studies done here in the United States and in Europe that show that noises from trains or airplanes or subway systems, elevated systems, highways do distract kids and prevent adequate learning. So in healthcare, medicine, public health, what have you, we all need definitions. We live and die by definitions. And so how does one define environmental health? And the Pew Commission on Environmental Health, now a decade or more ago, came up with this definition. I think for most of us, when we think about environmental health, the first thing we think about is chemicals. And we forget that there are physical factors like ultraviolet light, other forms of radiation. We forget that bacteria and viruses are part of the environment. And we also forget about social factors that are part of the environment. So we really have to think about this holistically and comprehensively. And then assessing, correcting, controlling, and preventing factors in the environment that may adversely affect the health of present and future generations. So the reality is, for me as a pediatrician who's spent a number of years actually taking care of kids in a primary care setting, correcting, controlling, that's not really part of what we can do in most instances in terms of adverse health consequences that occur as a result of environmental hazard, exposure to environmental hazards. For most problems that accrue as a result of an exposure to an environmental health hazard, there's no pill or potion or treatment that I can give that will reverse the problem in that child, or I would submit in adults either, but again, I'm a pediatrician. I mean, yes, you can, if a child's got asthma as a result of exposure to components of indoor air pollution, yes, you can certainly treat that asthma. but you can't turn off that asthma. There's no cure for that. You can manage it, but so you really have to be about prevention, and that's where we need to focus most of our time and energy. As we think about this process of the development of a child into an adult, and where are places in that pathway that can be perturbed that then will result in an adverse outcome, we actually have to start thinking even before conception occurs. There are exposures to men and women before they come together and fertilize that egg that can influence the sperm and then therefore influence the pregnancy that occurs as a result of the fertilization of the egg, and or exposures that can influence the eggs that then influence the outcome of the pregnancy. And for women, their eggs are, as best we know, all of the eggs that they will ever have in their lives are formed while they are in their mother's uterus. So it may actually be exposures to the grandmother that influence the developing ovaries of that female fetus in her uterus that then influence the outcome of the child that fetus will ultimately conceive 20 years down the road. So we have to think very long term. The other reason why we have to think very long term is with acute poisonings. Sure, somebody drinks something, they keel over dead. That's the the story of the Borgias, of arsenic and old lace, and all sorts of other acute toxic exposures. But in terms of environmental health, we're not generally talking about exposure and 20 minutes or even 2 or 3 hours later, somebody keeling over, sick or dead. What we're really talking about is long-term, low-dose exposures with outcomes that can be weeks, months, or even years down the road. So once conception occurs, you've got the embryo, goes on to the fetus, after birth, the infant, the toddler, the school-age child, and the adolescent. You're moving from, at the time of conception, one single cell to an adult with billions of individual cells. And each time those cells divide and each time the cells function, DNA is transcribed to messenger RNA and proteins are made. That's a lot of individual episodes where something can happen that can cause an adverse outcome. Now, by and large, as best we know, you can't change DNA acutely. But what you can change, as we're learning more and more now, is that DNA is surrounded by other molecules that influence how parts of the DNA get turned on or turned off. And some of you may have heard the term epigenetics, and that's what I'm referring to, the ability of chemicals around the DNA molecule to turn that DNA on and turn that DNA off. And it is becoming more and more clear that exposure to environmental toxicants can influence those chemicals that surround the DNA and therefore influence DNA transcription. So although DNA isn't changed, how it then controls the cell is changed. In various parts of the body, as development goes on, cells move. In the nervous system, cells link up with each other. That's called synaptogenesis. Also in the nervous system, cells get covered by a coating or an insulation like an electrical wire. That's called myelination. In the central nervous system and elsewhere in the body, some cells are supposed to die. The cells that develop don't all necessarily last for our entire life. They have a purpose at a certain time during development, and then they're supposed to go away. Well, so what happens if some cells that are supposed to go away, which is called apoptosis, doesn't happen? Then again, there may be an adverse outcome. And in human beings, some limited ability to repair or regenerate damaged organs. We all know about tadpoles or lizards that can regrow tails and things like that. We do have the ability, for example, to repair our livers. That's why you can transplant part of a liver from a healthy donor, not harm that donor, and put a small liver into a person whose liver has failed, and then that will grow and regenerate both for the donor and for the recipient. I think that everybody who knows anything about health and health care has some concept about in utero exposures and adverse outcomes that result from in utero exposures. At least for the people here in the room, raise your hand. How many of you know about thalidomide, and as a drug that women were given during their pregnancy that resulted in very severe deformities of the children's arms and legs? We also know that women who drink alcohol when they're pregnant can have adverse outcome in the children with mental retardation, sometimes birth defects in terms of abnormal heart structure. All of this depends on timing. So thalidomide given early in pregnancy creates those abnormalities of the limbs. But thalidomide given in the last trimester doesn't hurt anything. And thalidomide given to people who are not pregnant doesn't hurt anything. So timing during pregnancy is very important. Timing after birth is also important. Lead is a toxicant for children, primarily of the central nervous system. Lead is also a toxicant for adults, primarily of the peripheral nervous system, the kidneys, and some other parts of the body. So it's the same toxicant, different time of life of exposure, different outcome. For Caucasians, exposure to ultraviolet light leading to blistering sunburns, if that happens 5 times before the individual reaches about 20 or 21 years of age, their risk of developing malignant melanoma during adulthood, the relative risk has been tripled. So 5 blistering sunburns in a Caucasian individual prior to about age 21 triples their risk of subsequently developing malignant melanoma. 5 blistering sunburns or any blistering sunburns after 21 years of age in a Caucasian does not elevate their risk of developing malignant melanoma. Ultraviolet light, the same toxicant, exposure to the skin, but at a different time in life, and leads to a different outcome. So we know something about what happens in utero. We know a little bit about some exposures during early childhood and outcomes either in childhood or in adulthood. But puberty marks a time of fantastic changes in children. We've all been through it. We all have some recollection of those changes, and we all have seen others go through it and can appreciate how radical the changes are in the human body during those 2 to 3 years of pubertal change. And we have almost no research about the impact of environmental toxicant exposures during puberty. So let me just reiterate a little bit to drive home how much change is taking place in early childhood. And so if you just look at the weight of kids in the first 3 years of life, they double their birth weight by 4 months of age, and they quintuple their birth weight by 36 months of age. That's a lot of new cells. That's a lot of opportunity for something to go awry as the result of an environmental exposure. Let's talk about other differences between kids and adults, and I'm going to talk about kids in utero first. They obviously have a placenta, and the last time I looked, there's no adult who's walking around with a placenta anymore. So what does the placenta do? That's a big difference between kids in utero and adults. And if you look at a textbook of pediatrics or obstetrics and gynecology from 25 or 30 years ago, they would talk about the placental barrier, that the placenta protects the fetus from things that the mother is exposed to. Well, again, with thalidomide, with alcohol, with gamma radiation x-rays from therapeutic x-rays or diagnostic x-rays or atomic bomb x-rays, we know that the placenta doesn't function as a barrier in all cases and doesn't protect the fetuses in all cases. And in fact, sometimes the placenta moves toxicants from the mother's body and into the fetus at a high, such that the concentration in the fetus is higher than it is in the mom. Also, the placenta at 4 months of gestation is different than the placenta at 8 or 9 months of gestation. It too changes, even though its lifespan is only several months. Some of the things that influence whether a chemical can get across the placenta or not are the molecular size of that chemical, whether it's lipid soluble or water soluble, what is its ionization state, and whether there is or isn't a transport mechanism for either moving it into the fetus or moving it out of the fetus and back into the mother. And so some of the toxicity that we see as a result of maternal exposure to environmental toxicants may be direct effect on the fetus, that something actually got through the placenta and affected the fetus, but it also may be that that toxicant damaged the placenta, and then because the placenta wasn't functioning normally, the fetus does not develop normally, even though the material never actually got to the fetus itself. So when you think about little babies, or let's put it a different way, think about an adult. So hopefully most adults are taller than they're wide, and so you can kind of think of them like a box or a rectangle. And when you think about little tiny babies, do you see them as a rectangle, or what do you sort of see them as, sort of like a little ball? And they really are like balls. And one of the implications of that is that they've got more skin, they've got more surface area per unit of body weight than an adult does. And so if something is applied to the skin, intentionally or unintentionally, and can get through that skin, because not everything does get through the skin, then the child will receive a greater dose per unit of body weight than an adult will. And we'll talk about some examples of where this is important in a few minutes. I am a pediatrician. I am a big proponent of breastfeeding. I think that breastfeeding is very important for children, and except in unusual circumstances, all children should be breastfed for at least a year of life. So I tell you the following information about what's in breast milk, not to discourage people from breastfeeding, but to drive home the notion of how we as human beings, how we as a species have so fouled our own nest that that material, which should be absolutely ideal for nourishing young babies, comes with certain risks. Every single human being on this planet, male or female, no matter where they live on this planet, has certain toxic chemicals stored in their fatty tissue. Some of them are dioxins, some of them are polychlorinated biphenyls, some of them are DDT, even though in most countries DDT has been banned for 40 or 50 years, and some are other breakdown products of DDT, one of which is TCE. No, TCE is a volatile organic compound, but there are other breakdown products of DDT. When a woman breastfeeds, some of what is in her fat goes into her breast milk. So some of these fat-soluble chemicals will leave her body, in essence detoxifying her body, and move into the body of her infant. If the mother's got certain metals in her body, antimony, cobalt, copper, lead, manganese, mercury, zinc, some of which are important nutrients like copper, manganese, and zinc, they will move into the fetus, but excess amounts of those things can be hazardous, and of course lead is hazardous at any level, and they can move into the child. If moms are drinking or smoking during the time that they're breastfeeding, then cotinine and nicotine can move into the infant, and alcohol can move into the infant. So we talked a little bit about the difference in eating pattern between kids and adults, and this data is from a survey that's done on a regular basis by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, in some ways analogous to the NHANES data set that the CDC collects that some of you in the audience are familiar with. And this looks at fruit consumption. I've pulled information out on citrus fruits, other fruits, and apples in particular, and then I want you to look at the bottom line of this image about apples. And one of the things that you can see here is that kids consume about 10 times more apples on a gram per kilogram basis of body weight than an adult does. So if those apples have some kind of contaminant on them, the kids are going to get a higher dose of that contaminant than an adult who eats less apples because they also eat a greater variety of things, whereas at certain ages, kids may only be eating, cereals, apples, and bananas, and a few other, and some sort of milk product, hopefully breast milk. So we have to kind of understand this and keep this in mind. Little kids drink more water per unit of body weight than an adult does. So if that water is contaminated microbially, whether it's contaminated with metals, whether it's contaminated with organic chemicals, those kids are going to get a higher dose. You can see that 1-year-olds consume about twice as much water on a milliliter per kilo per day basis than does an adult. So I alluded to the changes that occur between the single cell at conception and the adult. But if we narrow it down to the central nervous system, before 3 weeks of age, which you can see in here with where I've got the pointer, those cells that go to form the central nervous system and the spinal cord are basically a flat layer of cells. And so they, as you can see, fold up and ultimately fold into the very complex pattern that is typical of the adult brain. In order for this brain to be normal, cells have to move at certain specified times from point A to point B. Cells have to make connections from one to the other, and these things are timed so that if something gets missed, there's no redo. You can't go back and say, well, cells didn't move from A to B at 13,523 hours after conception. Well, at 13,524 hours after conception, you can't do it because other things have changed. So if something got missed, it doesn't happen. And again, we have some capability of repair, regeneration, things like that, but by and large, if the original step didn't occur at the time it was supposed to occur, it won't occur. And as best we know, brains continue to mature until kids, if you can call a 25-year-old a kid, until kids are about 25 years of age. That's when myelination of the frontal lobes finally is completed. And that's why adolescents and young adults in their early 20s are thought to have such poor judgment sometimes, because it's the frontal lobes that are involved with helping people make decisions, and if they aren't finished yet, then the decision-making process may not be up to what we would all desire. Lungs On the one hand, I think it's obvious that an adult's chest is bigger than an infant's chest, so the lungs have to grow, but it's growth both in terms of division of the bronchial tree. So if this is the trachea and the main the windpipe here in the neck and in the upper chest, and then dividing into the main stem bronchi, then like the branches of a tree, you have to get new branches up until somewhere once you've reached your final adult height, which, as people know, generally occurs earlier in women than it does in men. And but whenever it is the individual has reached her or his adult height, then their lungs stop growing. And as you get more of the branches on this tree, then you also have to get more of the alveoli, which is the sacs where the oxygen actually goes into the blood and the carbon dioxide comes out of the blood. We know very clearly that kids who grow up in a more polluted environment in terms of air pollution have smaller lung capacity when they're in their early 20s than kids who grew up in an environment that is less polluted. The difference is not so great that those kids who grew up in the more polluted environment have symptoms. They don't realize that they're not sick, but when you do detailed tests of pulmonary function, they have smaller lungs. The other fact to keep in mind is each and every adult, as best we know, loses a small amount of lung function each year as we age. So if you have more reserve more pulmonary reserve because you grew up in a less polluted area at age 20, what will that mean compared to the kid who grew up in a more polluted area when you both reach 60? Is the one who grew up in a more polluted area going to have greater risk of chronic pulmonary disease that ostensibly had its onset in adulthood, but really goes back to exposures that occurred during childhood? The longitudinal studies haven't gotten to that point yet, but I certainly think it's something that we have to be cognizant of and worry about. If any of you have been around kids in the first, certainly weeks of life, but even in the first year or two of life, you know that kids don't breathe like adults do. And I can't tell you over my years as a primary care pediatrician how many parents brought kids into me for a regular checkup at 2 weeks or 1 month of age or 2 months of age and said, the baby's breathing funny, and I look at the baby and the baby's not breathing like an adult, but the baby's breathing like a normal baby, but it certainly looks funny to somebody who's not used to looking at little babies. They breathe more air per unit time than an adult does. Also, as kids get older, we want them outside and running around. We've got an obesity epidemic in this country. We want kids outside running. But what happens when kids run? They breathe more, and if the air that they are breathing is polluted, they get a higher dose of that pollution than an adult will. For those of you who were high school athletes or college athletes, unless you were swimmers who got up at some god-awful 4 o'clock in the morning to go to the pool, you were probably running around outside on the practice field at 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Well, certainly in urban areas, the peak air pollution occurs at 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The exhaust from the cars and trucks that was spewed out in the morning bakes in the sun during the day, and the air pollution peaks at exactly the time we send kids out to get their exercise to make them healthier. So we need to think about that. I don't know whether gastrointestinal tract absorption of other metals is different in adults versus children, but it is very clearly different as it relates to lead. So that kids less than 2 will absorb about half of the lead that they actually get into their stomach, whereas adults will only absorb about 10% of the lead that they get into their stomach. So the dose, if you will, if you measure what passes the lips, isn't really important. The dose is really what gets absorbed into the body. And that may be another reason why the toxic outcomes of lead, for example, are different for kids versus adults because the kids absorb more of what they ingest than an adult does. There are other differences between kids and adults in the liver. There are certain enzyme changes that occur as the liver matures. A lot of changes occur during the time of puberty in the liver, and the differences are also different between, the changes are different between boys and girls. The kidneys change from the time of birth. They actually reach adult function by about 1 year of age, but their ability to excrete toxicants in the very young child is different than in the older child or the adult. The skin, some things will go, they're applied to the skin, stay on the skin, other things get absorbed into the blood and circulate to the rest of the body. The ability for things to pass through the skin changes as the skin ages and reaches adult permeability by about a year of age. Back in the 1960s, there was a tragedy that occurred with a chemical that was used for cleaning the body called hexachlorophene. It's a very good chemical for killing bacteria called staph, and staphylococcal bacteria can be very serious infections in newborn nurseries. So people have always wanted to minimize the number of staphylococcal bacteria on newborn babies' skin to prevent this very serious infection. The problem is that when hexachlorophene in high doses is applied to the skin, particularly of premature infants, which then have even more ability to pass chemicals through that skin than a full-term child, so much of the hexachlorophene is absorbed that it damages the development of the brain. You and I could stand in hexachlorophene up to our neck, and not enough of it gets absorbed to matter, and our brains are finished, so at least in terms of development. And so we're not going to get holes in our brain the way a young infant would when exposed to hexachlorophene. The bones change over time. Everybody is familiar with the growth spurt. Again, that accompanies puberty, different timing in girls than in boys, and things that can cause premature fusion of the area of the bones where they grow will result in people being shorter than they otherwise would have been. Even the immune system changes as children grow. The thymus, which is in an organ that's in the chest of infants and newborns, by and large goes away by the time kids are 7 or 10, but it's part of the immune system. Other differences begin to occur again, around the time of puberty. And of course, again, I get back to all of the changes that are associated with puberty, the development of secondary sexual characteristics, the changes in glands in the central nervous system, like the hypothalamus and the pituitary, which then influence other glands elsewhere in the body, the differences between the testicles in males and the ovaries in females, and the differences in the pattern of puberty in women versus men. And then when you look at adolescence, there's some behavioral differences even between adolescents and younger kids. Some adolescents start to smoke, some adolescents start to drink. Adolescents have the independence that they can go to a store on their own and buy over-the-counter medications. They can get into using anabolic steroids, oral contraceptives, so and recreational drugs. So there are all sorts of things that can influence these systems in an adult, in an adolescent, that may also influence them in an adult, but would not have been there in younger children. So, at least for the people who are in the room with me, what are some other differences that you can think of between kids and adults that might influence their response to exposure to environmental toxicants? Kids are closer to the ground. If we had kids in this room, they would be rolling on the floor, not sitting in chairs. And I hope this room is not regularly sprayed with pesticides, but if they are in a room that is regularly sprayed with pesticides, the dust from those pesticides settles on the floor. Lead, when it flakes off of walls, that dust settles on the floor. So an adult who's in that same room with the pesticides or with the lead, by and large, is walking across the floor with their shoes on. They're not down on the floor. And also, for little kids, they put their hands in their mouth. So we all have a little bit of oil or a little bit of moisture on our hands, touch the dust, put the hands in our mouth, and that's how little kids get exposed to lead, pesticides, or any other hazardous material that might be in the indoor dust or outdoor dust, for that matter.
Adults can modify their environment, so if adults somewhere where it's really polluted, adults might be out of there, a child is dependent on adults.
So kids are dependent. They can't do things to take themselves out of a hazardous place and get to a safe place. And that's very true in terms of small-scale kinds of situations like rooms, and it's also very true and very important in very large-scale situations like natural disasters, hurricanes, floods, where exposure to environmental toxicants may be exacerbated by the natural or the man-made disaster. Kids are shorter than adults. So think about walking down the street, a parent with a breathing zone in terms of where their nose is that's somewhere between 4 or 5, for somebody who's really tall, maybe even 6 feet above the ground, and a little kid who's walking by that parent whose breathing zone is probably 2 or 3 feet or 4 feet off the ground, and that big yellow school bus with that real big tailpipe that's about 3 or 4 feet off the ground goes by. Who gets a bigger snootful of the pollution that's coming from the tailpipe of that bus? The kid whose nose is down there, or the adult whose nose is up here. Pretty clear. I've already talked about the kids running. Kids we think of as being at home, being at school. We don't think, except maybe for adolescents, about kids being in a work environment. But nowadays, I don't know what percentage of adults have an office in their home or some other business that they are running out of their basement, their garage, or where they may be bringing home hazardous substances from the workplace. They don't get a chance to change their shoes, their clothes, they don't get a chance to bathe, and they bring toxic chemicals home to their kids. In the Mid-Atlantic Center, we had a child with an elevated lead level several years ago. The only place that that child was getting exposed was his dad's car. His dad was a home renovator, kept all of his tools in the car. The home was clean. Their own home was clean. It didn't have lead, but in the car where there were these take-home toxins. The other thing that's really self-evident but really important to consider is that kids live longer than adults do. So, for example, if an outcome takes 40 years from the time of exposure, which may very well be the case, for example, if an environmental toxicant causes cancer, or if the damage that was done to the lungs in childhood doesn't really manifest itself until middle age or older. So if I'm exposed to something today and it's going to take 40 years for an adverse outcome to occur, I hope I'm around 40 years from now. But if that same exposure occurs to a 4-year-old or a 14-year-old, they are very likely to be around 40 years from now, and we need to keep that in mind. Now, in many instances, the dose of the toxicant is important. There are some toxic substances that have more adverse effect at actually lower doses than at higher doses, so it's not always true that the dose makes the poison. Some of you may have heard that phrase before. The length of time of exposure makes a difference. Remember, I talked about long-term low-dose exposure. So hypothetically, if a child lived in an environment where there was, say, no exposure to lead paint and swallowed a lead fishing weight and then excreted that lead fishing weight in her or his feces 48 hours later, then their only exposure would have lasted for 48 hours. But a kid in a home with old lead paint on the walls is going to be exposed for however many years he or she lives there, or at least until they get old enough to stop putting their hands in their mouth. So if they go home from the nursery and they start crawling at 6, 8, 9 months, then their exposure begins at 6, 8, 9 months and goes on for 2, 3, maybe even 4 years until they're not playing on the floor as much and putting their hands in their mouth. There are some differences in susceptibility based on genetic factors. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But cultural patterns and the way different people raise boys from the way they raise girls can also make a difference in exposure. If you think in the United States maybe 25 or 30 years ago, there were almost no girls in a shop class in high school, and there were almost no boys in a home ec class in high school. So whatever exposures may have occurred would have been different even though they were in the same grade and the same age, but their exposures would have been different. Nowadays, in countries where there's a lot of use of biomass fuel for heating or cooking, it's the girl children and the women who are home in the poorly ventilated housing where they're exposed to high levels of the particulates and other toxicants coming from the cooking or heating. The boy children are outside, they get a lower dose. So again, cultural patterns can affect exposures. One example of this issue about genetics influencing outcome, if you look at the broad group of women who smoke and the broad group of women who don't smoke, and look at pregnancy outcome, the broad group of women who smoke will have a higher proportion of children who are born with a cleft lip or palate than the women who didn't smoke. And so some people said, well, that's related to the mothers smoking. And it is, but when you drill down, there's actually a subset of the women who smoke who account for almost all of those kids with cleft lips and palates. And those women have a subtle genetic difference that changes how they metabolize something in tobacco smoke. And it's that really, it's a combination of that genetic difference and the tobacco smoke exposure that really leads to the clefts. So women who smoke who don't have this genetic variation have no more risk, or essentially no more risk, of delivering a child with a cleft than a woman who doesn't smoke. Poverty and minority status, whether you're in the United States or any place in the world, influence your exposure to environmental health hazards. Poor kids and minority kids are more likely to be exposed. In other countries, who is it who actually lives in the waste dumps? It's the poorest of the poor. In our own country, who is it who lives closer to the busier highways, has schools that are next to incinerators or bus barns, or in neighborhoods near the train tracks? It's the poor kids, it's the minority kids. Those are the ones who have the greatest exposures. Depending upon whether you look at data from the United States or you look at data from the European Union, it's estimated that somewhere between about 80,000 chemicals, that's the US number, about 110,000 chemicals, that's the EU number, are used in commerce on a regular basis. We have toxicologic data on very few of those chemicals. With the exception of drugs and pesticides, there is no requirement either in the EU, although they're starting to implement some, or in the United States for pre-market testing of chemicals looking for health hazards. Senator Lautenberg, Gillibrand, and Vitter have recently introduced some legislation that would modify the Toxic Substances Control Act, which currently exists in the United States, which does not control toxic substances. If that legislation is ultimately passed, hopefully we will get more data. We are currently getting more data through the EU program that goes by the acronym of REACH, but we still know absolutely nothing about most of the chemicals that are used in commerce. So if there are some questions that people have typed in or questions that people here in the room, so for those of you who are on the webinar, there's a portion of the screen where you can type questions and oh, okay. You can. So let me start with those of you here in the room. I've got some more material to present, but let me start with some questions here, and if any of you have questions, thanks. Okay, no questions. All right, well, then I will go on to some other material, and we'll stop again in a few more minutes for more questions. So when you, as public health professionals or just regular old people, are confronted with some environmental health issue that relates to a child, where can you go for some advice and counsel? And one of the best places to go is to your regional pediatric environmental health specialty unit. Anybody can access a pediatric environmental health specialty unit. Parent, school teacher, public health professional, physician, nurse, doesn't matter. Anybody can contact us. The PACEs do two things. One, we go around and teach about children's environmental health. That's what I'm doing today. And again, we answer questions from the public. This is a list of some of the kinds of issues that we deal with. It is not by any means a complete or exhaustive list of the problems that we deal with, but they range from lead poisoning to solvent exposures to job-related exposures among teenagers, hazardous waste site exposures, a whole lot of other things. As I mentioned, we are funded by the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, a part of the CDC, and by EPA. They move their money through the Association of Occupational and Environmental Clinics. For those of you who live in Region 3, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, and the District of Columbia, your pediatric environmental health specialty unit is the Mid-Atlantic Center for Children's Health and the Environment. For if there's anybody on the webinar side of things who lives somewhere else, or if those of you who are listening or here in person ultimately move, there are, as I said, 9 other pediatric environmental health specialty units that do the same thing that the Mid-Atlantic Center does. And we are based here at Children's National Medical Center and also have a colleague up at Children's Hospital in Philadelphia. I'm the director. Kevin Osterhout is a pediatrician toxicologist, and Veronica Tinney is our coordinator. And this is the contact information for us. We have a toll-free number for those of you who are outside the local 202 calling area. We have a website, and we have an email through Children's National Medical Center. And so I'm going to go to some of the cases and talk about some of the issues that we have dealt with. For those of you who don't know Prince George's County, there may be some who are not familiar. It wraps around part of the northeast and south sides of the District of Columbia. 50 years ago, Prince George's County was all rural. Now, there are still some rural components to Prince George's County, but they're much fewer and farther between, and a lot of it's suburban, and some of it's even would be considered urban. So this dad bought some property where he ultimately built a house that when he got married, he and his wife moved into it, and it was in an area that at the time he bought the property did not have piped-in water. So they were reliant on a well and a septic system. Next to this family's property was one military base, and then on the far side of that military base was a second military base. This property was downhill from those two bases, and there were streams that ran across the two bases and the property. When I saw this family, it consisted of the mom and the dad, a 15-year-old girl, and an 11-year-old set of fraternal twins. When those twins had been about 3 years of age, the family noticed that the water in their streams was funny, and they didn't really quite know what was making it different. But over the years, they had their well water analyzed and the stream water analyzed. And in the family well, they found trichloroethylene and tetrachloroethylene, which are solvents that are used to clean equipment, and they found heavy oil, which was something that was probably being cleaned off of that equipment by the trichloroethylene and the tetrachloroethylene. And further, they found some polychlorinated biphenyls, some TNT, some Royal demolition explosive, that is made in Great Britain, hence the name Royal, I guess, some chromium, lead, nickel, thallium, and some more trichloroethylene. So anybody want to make a guess where these chemicals might have been coming from that got into the streams and the drinking water on the family's property? Well, the military denied it. Something, we don't really know. The military denied any responsibility for this. But, you know, clearly when you got TNT and Royal demolition explosive. So when I examined these kids, I could find nothing abnormal. They were normal height, normal weight, normal blood pressure. They had done, you know, reasonably well in school. I could not find any chemical abnormalities of their liver, of their renal function, of their ability to form blood. They had been exposed to neurotoxins, nephrotoxins, hepatotoxins, and bone marrow toxins. But I could not document at the time I was seeing them any abnormality at that point in their lives. But you know and I know that as they go on, when they're 25, 35, who knows what, and they develop some kind of problem, the question will be asked whether it relates back to this exposure they had. They played in this water, they drank this water, they cooked with this water, they showered with this water. So that's one example. Here's another case. This one was actually managed by our colleagues in the PASU in New York, but it's an instructive case nonetheless. So this building at some point in the 90s and before was used to manufacture thermometers that contain mercury. That business closed down. The building was never cleaned up. And then in the early 2000s, the building was purchased and ultimately a child care center that was called, you can't probably read it, called Kitty College, spelled with a K. That maybe gives you some reason for pause, why anybody would send their kid to a child care center where they can't spell, but that's a separate issue. So kids moved in here for child care in the early 90s, and then a few years later, somebody, somehow, none of this is really very clear, notified the New Jersey Department of the Environment about what this old building had actually been used for. And when they went in and measured the amount of mercury in the air in this building, it was very high. When they measured the amount of mercury in the urine of most of these children, it was high, although thankfully most of the kids did not have any symptoms related to that mercury exposure. Thankfully, the daycare center was shut down, the building was cleaned up. And what the Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit did was to advise the public health authorities on how to manage the situation, advise individual pediatricians and family physicians about the management of individual children, and to work with these agencies in public meetings, developing messaging to the families about the risk associated with these exposures. Another case that came to us at the Mid-Atlantic Center, I was seeing this family when they were 5. It was a set of fraternal twins, again, a boy and a girl. And The girl was the one that the parents were concerned about. She was born at term after an uncomplicated pregnancy. Everything seemed normal at birth, but at about the time the kids were 3, the parents noticed that the girl's speech was not the same as her brother's, and her pattern of speech development was not that of a typical child. They also reported to me that at the same time the girl had become a very picky eater, and one of the few things that they could get her to eat was tuna fish. And the mother was feeding this child 5 to 7 meals per week of tuna fish for about a year on end. Now, some of you may know that tuna fish is one of the fish that may have high levels of methylmercury, which is a neurotoxicant, and has been associated in epidemiologic studies with some delay, lower IQ scores, and things like that. Not generally of the severity that was being manifest in this one girl. And what the parents wanted to do was somehow or another, they had no idea whether the tuna fish actually had methylmercury in it, how much their child got, but they were convinced that by removing mercury from this child's body, they could cure this child, which is just not the case. So one of the things that we often are confronted with in pediatric environmental health specialty units is to not only tell parents sometimes what can be done, but to tell parents sometimes what really can't be done. First of all, measuring mercury in her body 2 to 3 years after her exposure would have been meaningless, and for none of the neurotoxicants that I'm aware of, lead, mercury, or anything else for that matter, does any attempt at what's called chelation, giving medicine to remove metals from the body, reverse the cognitive abnormalities. My suspicion is that this child's development was atypical before the parents recognized it, and that's why she had, in fact, her atypical eating pattern was a manifestation of her neurocognitive problems and not really the cause of her neurocognitive problems. Another issue, a 1-year-old who had had a blood level of 11 micrograms per deciliter. They did some environmental assessment. Careful hand washing increased his consumption of calcium and iron, which then blocks absorption of lead from the GI tract, and the kid's blood level then was less than 2 micrograms per deciliter, less than what the lab at that time could measure. And then when the kid was 5 years old, he was diagnosed with pervasive developmental disorder, which is one of the manifestations on the autism spectrum of disorders. And they went to what I would only describe as a place where they should not have gone to, because a test was ordered that measured 80 different chemicals in this child's urine. There's a basic tenet of laboratory management in healthcare, and that is you only measure things that you think may be abnormal, and you have a plan, you know what normal means, and you have a plan for what to do if something is abnormal. If you measure a large number, if you do a large number of tests in any of us in this room, assuming we're all healthy, if you do enough tests, you're going to find 1 or 2 that come back abnormal just because statistically you've done so many tests. Most of these tests that are done in this manner are not valid tests. They don't measure anything that correlates with illness, but when the parents are told the results and told that some of the results are abnormal, they get concerned, and they were told that this child had an elevated urine lead level, that he should be treated with a chelator, and that his pervasive developmental disorder was a result of his previous blood lead level of 11 micrograms per deciliter. While elevated blood lead levels are associated with decreases in neurocognitive function, there is no relationship that I know of There's no case reports. There's certainly no epidemiologic studies linking lead exposure to any autism-like disorder. And they then went to a pediatric environmental health specialty unit. They were advised to manage the pervasive developmental disorder in school the way it would be managed and not to chelate this child because chelation was not going to be associated with any benefit. The last case I'll mention is is an example of something that we actually get a fair number of questions about each year, and that is exposure to mold. So this was a family living in a ground floor apartment or condominium. There was a hill outside of their sliding glass doors so that when it rained, water came down the hill onto their patio, and if it rained hard enough, came up over the lip of their sliding glass door and into the living unit. And that had happened about 4 years ago. They had cleaned up the damaged carpet and some other stuff. But recently, they had seen visible growth of mold in the building, in their apartment again. They had 3 kids, a 10, 7, and 5-year-old. The whole family, adults and children, had itchy nose, runny nose, stuffy nose, itchy eyes. It was worse when they were home, got better when they went outside. Pretty clearly, related to what was going on in their place of residence, because when parents went to work, kids went to school, things got better. That probably is an indication that the exposure had stopped. Good guess that it might in fact be the mold, because people can be allergic to mold. And even for people who are not allergic to mold, mold can be an irritant, can cause itchy red eyes, scratchy throat, coughing, runny nose, things like that. But what the family was worried about was, is exposure to mold associated with neurocognitive problems? The 10-year-old had previously been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, and I forget whether it was the 7-year-old or 5-year-old. The school was saying that this kid had some attention problems, even though he had not been formally tested or evaluated for attention deficit disorder. And while when you go on the web and look up information about mold, you will find a lot of very scary misinformation associating exposure to mold with adverse neurocognitive outcomes. There really has been no epidemiologic study and certainly no exposure outcome study that I'm aware of that actually documents an association between mold and neurocognitive problems. So we can help this family deal with how to, provide them with information about how to deal with the mold in their home, what the likely outcomes would be in terms of their respiratory tract symptoms, and then steer them away from doing something that might be useless, like looking to the mold as a way of dealing with the ADHD in the oldest kid or these purported attention problems in the one of the younger kids. So again, I'll stop there and ask for questions, either that the people in the online audience have, or if the people here in the room have. For those of you who are online, I'll read the questions. For those of you who are in the room, I'll repeat the questions to those online. For those of you who don't live in Region 3 and need to contact another pediatric environmental health specialty unit, if you go to the website for all of the pediatric environmental health specialty units, which is www.pehsu.net, you will find contact information for all 10 units. So another question, or one of the questions from online, is how often is mercury intoxication found or tested? Mercury intoxication is really quite rare in this day and age. It was a much more common problem when certain teething medicines contained mercury, so those were applied to kids' gums and, of course, then exposed them to large doses of mercury. Mercury was used for making felt hats And so the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland may have been mad in terms of crazy because of his exposure to mercury in terms of an on-the-job exposure. But but mercury exposure today is pretty rare. We all have some exposure to methylmercury through seafood, and that's why pregnant women and young children are cautioned about eating certain fish that are higher in methylmercury levels, like swordfish, tuna, and some of the other fish that are the bigger fish that eat the little fish, because mercury is bioaccumulated and biomagnified. So what the heck does that mean? So mercury gets into the air from coal and a number of other places, and then it gets into the rain, and then it gets into the water, and bacteria change that metallic mercury into an organic compound called methylmercury. So as you know, in the aquatic ecosystems, the bacteria are eaten by slightly bigger microorganisms, and those get eaten by little tiny fish, and those get eaten by bigger fish, which get eaten by bigger fish, et cetera, et cetera. And as the little tiny bits of mercury in the small microorganisms get into the bigger organisms, that mercury stays there. And then as those organisms get eaten by even bigger organisms, that mercury stays there as well. So ultimately, those things that are at the top of the food chain, like human beings or like the biggest fish, can get the highest doses. Another question is, how dangerous is BPA, such as plastic bottles, for children, and is it something we should be concerned about? Do you have any case studies on that? Well, BPA stands for bisphenol A. It is a component that was certainly in the past fairly commonly used in plastics. It makes them clear and hard so that it's good for using bottles. Many of the bottles that are now used in the United States are marketed as BPA-free, so there really aren't any case studies that we have. Again, this is low-dose, long-term exposure to an endocrine disrupting chemical. We don't know that the harm is there, but we know that the potential for harm was there when you're exposing millions and millions of people. So again, for the most part, most of the plastic bottles that are sold for containing water or really other things now do not contain BPA. But don't take a sort of, don't sigh and say, okay, then everything is safe, because remember, I mentioned that the Toxic Substances Control Act does not require pre-market screening of chemicals. So what was used in place of BPA in these bottles was not tested before it started to be used, and it will take 10, 20 years before we accumulate evidence as to whether those things are hazardous or not. Another case, the asthma rates are higher than in the last 20 years. Yes, that's for the most part true, at least here in the United States, where we've got some good data, and in Europe, where there's also good data. The question is that related to environmental exposures? And the answer is really not very clear. It's clear that some environmental toxicants, like the antigens from mice and rats and cockroaches, are associated with the development of asthma and with exacerbation of asthma in people who already have the disease. But the issue about actual air pollutants in terms of outdoor air or indoor air is less clear, particularly at the causal level. It's pretty clear that outdoor and indoor air pollutants can exacerbate asthma, cause people who already have the disease to have attacks and more attacks or more severe attacks. But the information is otherwise sort of controversial. So for example, if you look at the number of people who went to the number of kids, it wasn't done in adults, but the number of kids who went to the emergency room for the treatment of asthma in Atlanta during the 1996 Olympics, the number went down. Now, what does that have to do with air pollution? So in the run-up to the Olympics, they tried to convince people not to drive in Atlanta, to use public transportation, and the traffic counts during the Olympics really did go down, as did the visits to the emergency room for asthma. And interestingly enough, in Busan, Korea, where they also had a very large-scale international athletic event, and they tried to convince people not to drive in that city as well, also the asthma visits during the time of that international Olympic event went down. But the countervailing observation, and again, these are almost anecdotes, observations, it's not really, well done research. So I think as everybody is aware, in what used to be West Germany during the time that Germany was divided, they implemented some fairly rigorous air pollution controls on their factories. And in what was the former East Germany, they did not have those kind of rigorous air pollution controls. When when German reunification took place, air pollution controls were implemented in what used to be East Germany, and concomitantly asthma rates went up. So if the air pollution was causing, you would think that air pollution in the former East Germany would go down. I mean, that asthma in the former East Germany would go down. So again, there's data on both sides of this question. I don't think there's a very clear answer as to the role of air pollution, except in exacerbating asthma, but more study needs to be done. Other questions? Okay, well, I would invite any and all of you to contact the Mid-Atlantic Center for Children's Health and the Environment. Again, our email address is macche@childrensnational, all spelled out as one word, .org. And we would be happy to organize any presentations that you might like to have, try and help you with any questions or other issues related to children's health and the environment that you might have. And I thank you very much for participating here and on this webinar.